Shalom, welcome back. So we're continuing our delving into Egyptian history and trying to link it up with Israelite biblical history and re-examining the timeline of Egypt. I just watched a great movie yesterday, The Patterns of Exodus, the Patterns of Evidence movie. It's about the Exodus, and it was kind of a documentary. But a lot of the stuff that they were talking about in this movie is very similar to what Velikovsky wrote about in his book, Ages and Chaos. So if you've seen that movie, one of the things that they're looking into really is the differences between the events in the Egyptian history that seems to line up with events in the Israelite history and the history of Canaan. And their speculation is the same as Velikovsky's. In fact, I almost wonder if they read Velikovsky's book and used his research to as like a guide to put the movie together. I don't know. I don't know if they did that or not. I'm trying to give credit where credit is due. So I'm just being straight up with you. I'm taking all this from Velikovsky, but I did find it interesting that that movie, which of course is made 60 or 70 years after Velikovsky wrote his book, seems to corroborate everything that Velikovsky said, but they went a different direction to arrive at kind of the same conclusion or a similar conclusion. Although in Ages and Chaos he gets into a lot more detail, presents a lot more evidence, and I think that Velikovsky actually makes a lot better case. So we will get back into Velikovsky, but I did want to give you that piece of information. If you have Netflix, Patterns of Evidence is in Netflix for free. You can watch it. That's where I watched it yesterday. Okay, so we're still in Chapter 1 of Velikovsky's book. We're under the last section of Chapter 1. The heading is 2 questions. If you're following along in the PDF, you can find where I am, because usually the title at the top of the slide will tell you the section of the book that I'm reading from. It says there are 2 questions that demand an answer. The first is, what were the nature and dimensions of this catastrophe, or the series of catastrophes accompanied by plagues, about which we have now very similar scriptural and Egyptian testimony. In the next chapter, we shall also have the corroborating Autochthonous tradition of the Arabian Peninsula. I know I probably butchered that word, but maybe you can do better at it than I did. A reply to this question involves study not only of history but also of many other fields. A work compromising the investigation of the nature of great catastrophes of the past preceded this volume. So this work that he's talking about is his book, Worlds in Collision. Again, I recommend reading it. Velikovsky, in this current work that we're studying, Ages and Chaos, he refers back to the Worlds in Collision, but he really goes into detail about a lot of what his theory is, especially when he's mentioning the earthquakes and the hurricane and that sort of thing. The evidence for why he believes there was an earthquake and a hurricane, force winds, and all this other stuff in the Exodus is explored in depth in that book. So, and all of his books are cited. They have all the information, where he got his information from, all the work cited and such. So, if you're wondering where he's getting some of his information, get the PDF or get yourself a hard copy of the book and read it. It's worth the read. Says, leaving aside here the first problem of the extent and character of the catastrophe, we turn to the other question: when did the upheaval occur? In Israel's history, the answer is at hand, in the days of the Exodus. As for Egyptian history, we must first find out when the text of the papyrus Ipuwer was originated, or Ipuwer. Scholars have studied this papyrus, agree that the document is a copy of a still older papyrus, the scribe used a manuscript a few centuries older, according to Garnier. The copy was made sometime during the 19th dynasty, but the spelling is, on the whole, that of a literary text of the Middle Kingdom, if this term be interpreted in a very liberal way. So basically, the text itself is too young to have been written in the Middle Kingdom, but it shows the vocabulary and the spelling used in the 19th dynasty, or the Middle Kingdom. Now, the Middle Kingdom was when Egypt reached its pinnacle of literature and scholarship, and it was kind of like the golden age of Egypt as far as arts and such go. So the text shows evidence for being written in the Middle Kingdom, but I guess the dating of the text itself is too late. So they're saying, well, it's probably a copy of an earlier text. So it was written originally in the Middle Kingdom and then copied in the New Kingdom. I think that what Velikovsky is going into here really is that possibly it was a copy of an earlier text, or possibly the Middle Kingdom was not as far back in history as they thought. And that's why the dating of the papyrus itself would indicate that it was younger than the text would indicate. The question, when did the text originate, grows in importance in view of the parallels with the book of Exodus presented here. It was understood that the question of the age of the text is inextricably bound up with the problem as to the historical situation that the author, Ippawar, had in his mind. The text tells both of civil war and of an Asiatic occupation of the Delta. There are two periods which might possibly answer the requirement of this case. The one is the Dark Age that separates the 6th from the 11th dynasty, or the Old Kingdom from the Middle Kingdom. The other is the Hyksos period between the Middle and the New Kingdom. Okay, so there's three primary periods in Egyptian history. There's the Old Kingdom, and then after the Old Kingdom there was a period like a Dark Age. Then there was the Middle Kingdom. Then there was another Dark Age when the Hyksos came in, and then there was the New Kingdom. So separating these three kingdoms is a period of which are a type of Dark Age. The opinions of the papyrologists Garnier and Seth were divided on the question, to which of these periods does the text of the papyrus relate? There is no definite knowledge of any invasion by Asiatics during the first period, that between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and to conform with the historical background of the papyrus, such an invasion at that time must be first postulated with the help of the papyrus. There is no such difficulty in the view preferred by Seth, who maintained that the time described is the invasion of the Hyksos. Garnier conceded and added the view that our Leiden papyrus contained allusion to the Hyksos as the better support from the historical standpoint. So both of these historians who are studying this papyrus, they both conclude that the chances are it's speaking about the invasion of the Hyksos. So notice that the papyrus also described all the cataclysms and whether natural or supernatural, the plagues that came upon Egypt, and the invasion of the Hyksos. Like, it's all described there in one document, this papyrus of Ippawar. But a philological consideration makes us wish to put back the date of the composition as far as possible. The language was found beyond doubt and not of the New Kingdom, but of an earlier time. The text also contains some references to the establishment of great houses or law courts, which became obsolete in or soon after the Middle Kingdom. So again, the internal evidence inside of the document is pointing toward the Middle Kingdom. We should remember that these great houses are described in the papyrus are fallen down and trodden upon by the throngs who dug in the ruins. This mention, it seems to me, points even more precisely to the time when the Middle Kingdom collapsed, and the papyrus should not, on the basis of it, be interpreted as a literary document composed in pre-Hyksos times. From the standpoint of style and language, Garnier admitted, it is of course possible that our text may have been composed while the Hyksos were still in the land. The discussion of whether the text describes the period between the Old and Middle Kingdoms or between the Middle and New Kingdoms was closed by the supporter of the first view with this remark: "It is doubtless wise to leave the question open for the present." I take up the question. The historical background is that of the invasion of the Hyksos. Philological considerations show that the text has all the signs of a literary product of the Middle Kingdom. So Velikovsky is not really disputing these people's opinion about the literary style being out of the Middle Kingdom. He is taking up the second view, which is that it was composed between the Middle and New Kingdom, immediately after the collapse of the Middle Kingdom. And that's why it reflects the vocabulary and style of the Middle Kingdom, was because it was written immediately after the collapse of that kingdom, before the people who lived in the Middle Kingdom had passed away. When the historical and philological proofs are combined, all point to the end of the Middle Kingdom, in the very beginning of the invasion of the Hyksos. The style would still be, of course, that of the Middle Kingdom, because in the few months since the end of the Great Age, no change in the language and form of poetic works could have occurred. In the centuries of domination by the Hyksos, literary activity ceased in Egypt. Besides, it is obvious that Ipuwer bewails the tragedy of his own time and not of a past age. The dispute between Garnier and Seth, Garnier is right in his philological arguments that the latest period from which the text could have been originated is the time of the Hyksos. However, he is mistaken in assuming that the text describes events of the dark period between the Old and Middle Kingdoms. And Seth is right in the historical argument that the events described are those of the invasion of the Hyksos after the fall of the Middle Kingdom. On the other hand, Seth is mistaken when he ascribes the composition of the text to the New Kingdom, it was composed immediately after the fall of the Middle Kingdom and the very beginning of the Hyksos period. The historical arguments as well as the philological arguments are in harmony with this solution. Those who have tried to place the Exodus in the sequence of Egyptian history have not have not dared to set it as far back as between the Middle and New Kingdoms, or the time of the Hyksos, and of course not as far back as between the Old and the Middle Kingdoms. Not only is the invasion of the Amu, or the Hyksos, the historical background of the admonitions, so are the physical catastrophes and the plagues, and these are analogous to those of the time of the Exodus. On this basis, too, there can be no doubt that the earlier date between the Old and Middle Kingdoms is out of the question, and even the later one is embarrassingly enough, for it appears to be too early for the Exodus. Okay, so basically saying that it can't be between the Old and the Middle Kingdom, because if even between the Middle and the New Kingdom is still too far back for the Exodus. So if the period of between the Middle and New Kingdom is too late, too early, then certainly the one that's even further back is too early. So it's really not even worth considering, because it would be even worse than the first one. Says, is there any physical evidence known which would indicate that some major change occurred in the geologic structure of Egypt at some point of time following the Middle Kingdom? And of course, he's looking at this, going back to his earthquake theory. Lepsius has observed the remarkable fact that the kilometers at Semneh during the dating from the Middle Kingdom show an average rise in the waters of the Nile at that place, where the river is channeled in rock 22 feet higher than the highest level of today. Theoretically, the dropping of the water level by 22 feet must be ascribed either to a change in the quantity of water in the structure in the Nile since the Middle Kingdom, or to a change in the rock structure of Egypt. So After the Middle Kingdom, there was a change in the Velikovsky saying in the geological makeup of Egypt, and that caused the water level to change. If the Nile had contained so much more water before the catastrophe, many residences and temples would have been regularly covered with water. Apparently, in nilometers at Semina indicate that some violent change in the rock formation of Egypt took place at the end of the Middle Kingdom or later. The Middle Minoan Age, which is the period of the Cretan culture coeval with the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, also came to a close in a terrible natural catastrophe as the excavations at Knossos reveal. There exists an important Egyptian inscription of the queen Hatshepsut, who came to power 2 or 3 generations after the expulsion of the Hyksos, in which it is written, "The abode of the mistress of Kes was fallen and ruined. The earth has swallowed her beautiful sanctuary, and children played over her temple. I cleared and rebuilt it anew. I restored that which was in ruins, and I completed that which was left unfinished. For there had been Amu in Mist of the Delta, and in Haur, or Aureus, and the foreign hordes of their number had destroyed the ancient works. They reigned ignorant of the god Ra." So this queen Hatshepsut, who is being mentioned here in this inscription that describes this fallen temple and connects it with the Amu being in the midst of the land. Later on, Velikovsky links her to the Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon. So in the time of Solomon, immediately after the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, you see this being written about, the Hyksos reigning over the destroyed temple. So these lines contain an inference that temples were swallowed in the ground, and that the Hyksos, who took possession of the country, did not care to restore the ruins, and even added to the destruction. The Hyksos destroyed, but they did not bury buildings in the ground. Does this mean that the temple disappeared in an earthquake? In all 3 Egyptian documents quoted, the Papyrus of Leiden, the writings of the Shrine of El Arish, and the Papyrus of Hermitage, and also in the inscription of Hatshepsut, the natural catastrophe and the invasion of the Amu are described as one following the other, and as the natural catastrophes consisted of a series of upheavals and disturbances. The invasion of the peoples from Asia occurred before the elements calmed. At various times since the days of antiquity, several authors have identified the Israelites with the Hyksos. Other authors have placed the arrival of the Israelites in the period of the Hyksos rule in Egypt and the exodus of the Israelites in the reign of one of the kings of the 18th dynasty. The majority of scholars, however, think that the sojourn of the Israelites took place in a still later period. They relate the coming of the Israelites to some point of time during the 18th dynasty and place the period of oppression in the days of Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty and the Exodus in the days of his successor, Merenidtha. So, and this is something I mentioned that movie earlier that they go into detail about. The reason that people think that the Israelites came out of Egypt during the reign of Ramesses II is because the book of the Exodus mentions the city of Ramesses. Now, the creator of the movie made an interesting observation that Ramesses is also mentioned. The land of Ramesses is mentioned in the book of Genesis as just a location, but not necessarily what the place was called at the time. So, in other words, the creator of the movie thinks that the reason it says the city of Ramesses was so that the Israelites of the present day, back when that copy of the Exodus was being written, so that they would know where it was that the children of Israel settled. And so, even though the book of Exodus says the city of Ramesses at the time, it was called something different. It wasn't called the city of Ramesses until several hundred years later, when Ramesses actually rebuilt the city there. And that it was just put in the book of the Exodus so that people, the Israelites reading it at the time, several hundred years after the Exodus, at the time that some scribe inserted that, it was just kind of an FYI, this is where the Israelites were. It says, I have arrived at a very different result. The Israelites left Egypt amid the outbreak of a great natural catastrophe. The Amu, who invaded Egypt and became the masters of the land immediately afterward, were obviously not the Israelites. The tradition of the Israelites definitely connects their departure from Egypt with the days when earth, sky, and sea excelled in wrath and destruction, but knows nothing of their arrival in Egypt in the days of a cataclysm. So the Hyksos can't be the Israelites, because the Israelites did not come into Egypt during the time of a cataclysm. They came in during the 7 years of plenty. Not, there was no cataclysm then. The dwellers of the marshes or the poor men left the country under these very circumstances. They must have been Israelites and the multitude of the Egyptians who accompanied them in the Exodus. Actually, I need to back up. They did not come in during the time of the plenty. They came in the second year of the 7 years of famine. But still, there was no mention of any kind of natural catastrophes causing the famine. It was just a natural cycle of events. The Amu Hyksos reached the land of Egypt, on which they came to pray a short time after the catastrophe. In the above parallels and these conclusions, if the above parallels and these conclusions are correct, then the exodus of the Israelites preceded by a few days or weeks the invasion of the Hyksos. So essentially, the Israelites left Egypt, and within days afterwards, in came the Hyksos, and they took over Egypt. Okay, so now that we've got some background, we're ready to identify the Hyksos, and so we're going to be starting the next video at the beginning of chapter 2, and this is where Velikovsky really kind of uses this information to identify who these mysterious Hyksos were. And believe it or not, we're going to find them right in the pages of our Bible. So thank you for listening, and shalom.